Okay, cool. So welcome to the first webinar of Open 2019. This one is about catalyzing collaboration at scale. And first I'd like to introduce everyone. I'll just literally work from left to right across the top. So firstly, I am Oliver, Sylvester-Bradley from the Open Co-op. And I wanted to ask the panelists if they could just introduce themselves a little bit, say who they are, where they are, and what they do for work, just so that people have some context about how you support yourselves, which to me seems quite important in these discussions. And then we'll move on to the kind of meat of talking about collaboration. So yeah, I'm Oliver Sylvester-Bradley, and I'm in London, and most of the time to earn money to survive, I do marketing for solar energy companies and charities. And in my spare time, I organize the Open Co-op, and more recently, the Open Credit Network as well, along with Dill, who is co-hosting here in this webinar. So I'll now pass you over to Indra to answer the same.
Hi there, so I'm Indra Adnan. I'm the co-initiator of the Alternative UK. How do I earn money? Well, we have a little bit of funding, but I'm also a psychotherapist, and I'm a consultant too on soft power. So those are the ways I earn money. And the Alternative UK is a new political platform which came into being to answer the question, if politics is broken, what's the alternative? And I'm in London, and we sure need an alternative right now.
Great, thanks, Indra. Matthew.
Yeah, I'm Matthew Schutte. I am currently in San Francisco at my home with toys all around. For work, I basically run around the world explaining a project called Holochain, which is a framework or a pattern for building peer-to-peer applications, meaning applications that run on just the devices of the users themselves. The idea there is that humans should be able to communicate and coordinate without needing to have a corporation in the middle. That's it.
Cool, thanks, Matthew. Laura.
Hi folks, I'm Laura James. I'm in Cambridge in the UK, and I'm in my local makerspace, which I actually co-founded a few years back. I'm an engineer by training, and I've become very frustrated by the limited options for applying my trade working with emerging technologies. In the last few years, I've been interested in how we can get the tech industry to be more responsible, and also new models, including cooperative and collaborative models around shared and open IP that let us do emerging tech in better ways. So luckily, that mostly pays my bills at the moment, between an organization called .Everyone, which is a charity, and the University of Cambridge, where I'm based in the Department of Computer Science and Technology.
Excellent. Thanks, Laura. Nathan.
Hi, I'm Nathan Schneider, and I am in Boulder, Colorado, where this is my office at the University of Colorado Boulder, which is also the source of my livelihood, and that enables me to do work supporting cooperative and other kinds of democratic projects in tech and beyond.
Ace, so if we get any other panelists come and join, then we will jump in and get their introductions a little bit later. But for now, I wanted to kind of kick off and explain a bit of the context about what I was hoping that we could discuss in this session about catalyzing collaboration at scale. So the basic premise, and I don't want to rabbit on too long, but the idea is that obviously we've got hundreds of groups and communities around the world, as we all know, which are working on similar ideas and trying to create a better world in which people and planet come before profit, or building sustainable economies, building regenerative economy, however you want to describe it. But we have not really learned how to collaborate very well yet, I believe. We all work in our own disparate silos, and it's very hard sometimes to see the bigger picture and get this overview of which groups exactly are working on what, and where the overlaps are, and where the possibilities for increased collaboration lie. So this webinar specifically aims to explore ways in which we could encourage greater collaboration between those groups and communities so that they could work better and be more effective together to deliver the kind of synergistic results which you get when small parts of a system deliver impacts greater than the sum of their parts. But we're also interested in improving collaboration within groups too. So I think anything which touches on intergroup collaboration or inner group collaboration is all part of this discussion. And I just wanted to sort of kick off a first round of questions, seeing if we could form some agreement just to base the discussion in terms of what we actually think collaboration is, and perhaps even giving examples of where we've seen it happen before, just to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. Indra, would you be happy to kick off with that?
Yeah, I don't mind. I mean, I confess that we're working at a very analog level with communities and spaces, but within a bigger system of people's projects that sort of want to come together. So I don't think it's simply described, and when we try to describe it, we have difficulty in getting it across. And what is the difficulty at the moment is that when people try to describe the grassroots movements that are trying to work better together and provide some sort of alternative ways of coming to solutions to political, they only really think of a sort of vertical rising of people from the bottom up, so to speak. So they think about, activism, they think about, Occupy, they think about, literally people standing up, but they don't think enough about, or we don't think enough about, how they can collaborate in new ways that link people to systems and solutions that already exist, for example, in a city or in a region. So what is the nature of that collaboration, and what we're aiming for is sometimes the first thing that we have to try to define. So in a political scenario, we're dealing almost entirely with people looking at each other across clashes of narratives. They're talking about, how to get over their clashes of ideas rather than how to start from afresh and work together as people living in a community. So the obstacles are there. And if you want me just to talk very briefly, I don't know how much time you wanted to give me, but just very briefly about what we're doing. We're doing 3 different kinds of activities at the Alternative. One is to address these clashing narratives. So how we conceive of it is that only 2% of people are members of political parties, and that they, in a way, are holding the discourse around what politics is. And the media feeds off that. And what we're looking at is what's happening in the 98%. Can we source a new narrative around power from outside of that political bubble? So that's the first thing we do. The second thing we do is we try to initiate collaboration amongst the people, as you describe, are so siloed, that need to come together in order to offer a genuine alternative to people in terms of solution making and solution providing in a very specific time, which is the 12-year window of the environment of the environmental problem of climate catastrophe. And then the third thing that we're doing is trying to find ways for people living in places, so cities, regions, towns, to meet each other better in the face of these divisive narratives, to begin to collaborate in a practical way on the ground. So those things we're trying to do. And we've developed this idea of collaboratories. Collaboratories are where people meet in spaces, on a friendly basis and not on a political basis, to understand each other, know each other better, and through the forming of relationship between them in real time, that starts to provide, the basis of collaboration in the future.
That sounds like a pretty good definition of collaboration to me. I mean, but obviously in what you've talked about is the face-to-face world. I guess Matthew's world is slightly different. It'd be interesting to hear his perspective on what you've said versus what they're working on at Holo.
Well, I actually want to broaden it a little bit more. I want to take issue with the focus on intergroup and intragroup, or inner group. collaboration because it makes the perspective and the boundary line the group. And I think that therein lies the problem. That when you do that, if we start there, we've accidentally accepted the invisible architectures of the failed system that we're trying to. And the lessons of the Industrial Revolution are pretty straightforward, right? They were get people into agreement, get them into alignment, get them so that they're moving in the same direction. They agree on purpose, right? They know what they're trying to do, and then treat them like parts in a machine so that you can get that machine humming and increase efficiency, right? The main insight was more widgets through the same process results in a lower cost per unit, right? And I learned this in my own life when I was printing t-shirts. And I would print a one-off t-shirt and sell it for $36 and make $32 worth of profit. And then sometimes I would print a 2,000 t-shirt run and I would basically make $1 each. But the setup time and the breakdown time made it so that I was really only making about $15 an hour when I did that one t-shirt, and I was making about $100 an hour or $200 an hour when I was doing the 2,000 t-shirts, right? Because it still it took me an hour of setup and an hour of breakdown, whether I was printing one t-shirt or 2,000. And that focus on efficiency and focus on creating alignment in order to maximize efficiency is what we've been focused on for a really long time. And I think it's actually the problem. So to touch more on what Ollie had asked me to make clear, we're trying to shift how people can communicate and coordinate by building this new framework, right? This way that people can build and run applications. And at the core of what we're trying to do, I'm not going to talk about the internet stuff, I'm going to talk about the philosophy side of this for just a second. At the core of what we're trying to do is to recognize that in order for people to coordinate, for them to do something together, for me to do something that has influence on you or changes your life in some way, there needs to be some shared grammar, some shared form of information. Now, right now, we're making use of sound, light, cameras, internet protocols. There's all these different layers there, right? But even if we were just in a room and there was no light, but we did have air in the room and we had vocal cords and eardrums, we could use sound to communicate. And thanks to that ability to express information and receive information, we would have an ability to start trying to coordinate in some way, right? We may learn how to dance together well. Now, the dancing that we might do could simply be singing, right? I sing a note, and then Ollie sings a note, and we go, oh, that sounds off, and we adjust, and we start to harmonize in some way. And then, more stuff can happen there. But this idea of coming into alignment with a party that you're interacting with can enable essentially a relationship there and some ability to learn how to dance and dance more coherently in the context that you find yourself in. But if we try to generate that alignment from the top, from some group-wide definition, we fairly quickly reach sort of a maximum scale of coordinative capacity. And when you look at how natural living systems do coordination, they don't incorporate. They don't define the purpose of the forest. The forest doesn't have some set of letters embossed on the wall saying, we're dedicated to blank. That's not the way that forests do their coordination. And the result is that they're capable of doing so much richer coordination as a result. Our goal is to enable humanity to leverage some of these patterns that can lead to far greater complexity on the solutions side. already we as humanity are facing incredible complexity on the problems side, right? The context that we're facing is becoming incredibly complex, and the institutional collaboration technologies that we make use of are incapable of matching that complexity. And if you have simple solutions and complex problems, you go extinct. Because the world around you is changing faster than you can respond. There's something called Ashby's law of requisite variety that touches on this. And so what's needed is actually increased complexity on the solution side, on the responsiveness side. And we're trying to create tools, technology, that can foster that type of coordinative capacity. I'll leave it there for now.
Yes, I just wanted to pick up quickly, Matthew, on what you said there about the boundaries of groups. Like, I recognize what you said there, that you consider that to be part of the problem, like identifying this group's boundary sits here and this group's boundary sits there. Maybe you could just quickly explain what you think would be a better alternative.
Yeah, it's really subtle and nuanced, and it runs counter to how not only our culture describes the world, but how our bodies are in some level built to perceive of and make sense of the world. But there's a mental shortcut of naming, right? So, I don't know, I've got this little egg thing here, and it's a shaker. And if I shake it, you know, it makes some sound, and we'll call that the shaker, right? And calling it the shaker is a useful thing, because if I say, hey, Nathan, can you pick up the shaker? And we've interacted before, he'll, you know, grab the thing and hand it to me, and we can start to interact. It also makes it easier for me to perceive of and make sense of the world, because I'm not having to think about this thing in all of its complexity. All of the little beads inside each one, the relationships between them, the temperature. I'm able to go, it's the shaker. And that heuristic, that simplification, is a really useful thing. But it's not actually what's happening. Even though this thing seems like it has a boundary, right? The edge of the egg or the edge of the shaker. The reality is that it is constantly interacting with the world around it. So when I go, it bumps air molecules with sound waves, sending those into the microphone or into my eardrums, etc. There's flows of to heat, temperature that are happening. There may be chemical reactions. If this were made of metal and we sat there and watched it for 100 years, it might rust and turn to dust and blow away. It is interacting with its surrounding environment. And though it's a useful heuristic to describe it as a thing, an object, it's not. It's actually a dance of things that are themselves dances. And that sounds super abstract, right? But that's a more accurate description of what's happening. And each of the dancers in the world has a perspective. They have mediums or carriers or grammars that they are sensitive to. So because this thing is made of atoms and molecules, they speak the grammars of atoms and molecules. And when one bumps into another, the other moves. Kind of Newtonian physics type stuff, right? That may not be the only thing the only grammar they speak. They may also be electromagnetic in terms of conductivity or yada, 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 right? But to take this back to the group, right? To take it out of the physical world and talk about the social world for just a second. We will look at a company and say, hey, this person is an employee and this person is a customer, not an employee. And we're going to treat them differently. And we may even come up with rules. The bathroom is for employees only, right? And our attempts to organize the activity by seeing the system from above, by mapping the system and going, here's all the different objects, here's all the entities, and here's the boundary line. And these things are inside employees, and these things are outside non-employees. And employees are the only ones who get to use the restroom. It's a useful tool, right? It's a useful tool for helping those people come into alignment. But it's not actually how that boundary gets drawn, because if a customer walks into the shop and says, hey, can I use the restroom? And the person behind the counter is smitten. They may go, sure. And suddenly the restroom isn't for employees any longer, or at least not exclusively, right? Because the actual boundary of the group isn't defined in the paperwork at the incorporation documents or from the planning meeting from last quarter. The boundary of the group is defined by the actions. And those actions are taken by each participant and are informed by their particular perspectives. Which means that the attempt to get from above of the group actually reduces the complexity and richness of what is happening in that system by making it be filtered by whoever the mapper is. Now, that might be a single individual. It might be mitigated through some process like board meetings and quarterly reviews and hirings and firings and enforcement of property rights through the calling of police. You're not allowed to be on the property any longer. Right? All of those things are tools for enforcing boundaries from above. But the costs of enforcing boundaries from above is an inability to deal with the complexity of what's actually happening. Because we lose the variation of perspective that leads to the crossing of boundaries like what's going to be happening in this call today. Because Nathan brings a very different worldview than Matthew brings, which is a very different worldview from what Laura brings and Indra and Ollie. And each of us coming in from these different perspectives enables us as a group to see the blind spots that may have been invisible to us. Because from our view, we saw the world like this and we didn't realize that there was something over here. So I'll just stop for right now, and because it's been a lot of me talking. So I'll leave it.
That's good. Thank you, Matthew. Laura, can you come back to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I'm an engineer. I like very tangible, practical things. So I always love these very different narratives, and I can see, as per some of the comments, some of the sort of permaculture ideas and things coming through and what Matthew was saying there. But for me, I'm always interested in what can we actually do to make collaborations work. And I think the original question you were asking, Ollie, was sort of what is collaboration? I think collaboration and cooperation are slightly different. And I guess perhaps it's easier for me to use an illustration of something I see as an interesting collaboration. I think boundaries have a role because boundaries between groups can help us understand that we're not all the same and that we are pursuing slightly different goals quite often, and that we can also have groups with different language, different values, and so on. And so my example that I would pick is a collaborative engineering example. So most people probably here have heard about Linux, and they see that that's collaborative open source engineering. But I would pick a more specific example, which is the work done by Linaro, a group that I know well, and they do Linux specifically for ARM microprocessors. And they do collaborative engineering. So they have a lot of big corporations who share very different businesses and very different market sectors. So people like Facebook and Samsung and car manufacturers, all kinds of people, they all want to use Linux, but they're all trying to realize different business value by doing so. And Linaro enables them to collaborate on the bits of Linux that are not differentiating for them. So the deep sort of fundamental bits and pieces of the operating system everyone benefits from having done well. All these companies benefit from. It's open source, and no one has particular ownership of the output. It's like a club good. But at the same time, each of these companies is contributing money and engineers to that shared effort of collaborating to build something they all benefit from. And so for me, I think that's an interesting example of collaboration. There are clear boundaries. People are actually working in the collaboration, actually employed by different companies with very different ideas of what they're trying to do in the world. But they can still get together and build a shared good that they, and in fact everyone else, because it's open source, can benefit from. So for me, I think that's what collaboration is, and it's a little bit different from, say, the cooperation that a community group might have to raise a barn or build a makerspace or whatever you might do more on an individual's getting together to do something. Cooperation. I don't know if that was helpful, but that's my thought.
Absolutely, yeah, very interesting. Nathan. Oh, hang on, I'll just unmute you, or you can unmute yourself. There you go.
Got it. Great. Thanks for all that others have shared. I think I'm less convinced than Matthew maybe that we have shed every feature of the industrial world. I think there are some things that some things around alignment and especially that idea of shared purpose that I think are very crucially human and enable us to achieve things that are not as achievable in the forest, and those include things like solidarity and forms of connection. I'm going to offer 3 quick examples of just kind of patterns of collaboration, both old and new. One is the Associated Press, which is one of the most powerful media, probably one of the most powerful media cooperatives in the world. Perhaps the most, reaches half the population of the world each day. It was founded by a bunch of New York newspaper owners who hated each other and were ruthlessly competing with each other. But there was one thing, getting dispatches from abroad and from the front of the Mexican War, that they found they could do much more efficiently together. So this is an example of something like what Laura just described, where there's a narrow point of overlap among people who are meanwhile competing. And actually that dynamic of combining competition with a kind of clearly defined collaboration can be quite powerful, because you get both the creative and the creativity that sometimes emerges from competitive dynamics, as well as the kind of alignment, shared purpose that can emerge in a collaborative dynamic. Another example is the development of the rural electric cooperatives in the United States, now powering about 70% of the landmass of the United States, these rural utilities that are owned by their customers. This was made possible by a top-down process. I don't think we can throw away what appears to be the top-down entirely, but it enabled a bottom-up result. By creating a federal loan program, it created incentives for local communities of farmers to, in their own ways, as they saw fit, develop their own electric cooperative. So it was a system-level incentive that enabled bottom-up emergent solutions to occur. And those were non-competitive solutions. So they were operating in their distinct territories. They kind of charted out their distinct territories and worked within them. And so it allowed a non-competitive emergent process to happen. A third example that is very much a work in progress is just the kinds of collaboration I've been seeing on emerging blockchain protocols. I was just at a meeting with a bunch of leading Ethereum people, and they were yelling at each other about how to solve this problem of they're trying to make some changes to the Ethereum core code base, and they're doing politics all over again. They can't believe this. We thought we invented this technology to do away with politics, right? And they find themselves texting with Chinese miners, trying to convince them to accept this update to the code, right? And in those communities and so many others that I've looked at in this emerging blockchain space, they're trying to develop tools for coordination through these blockchains, but so much of their actual communication and collaboration happens in the horror of Telegram groups, where every morning you wake up and you've got 5,000 unread messages, and you can't possibly keep track of who's talking to who and what's going on. It's the most aggravating consequence of a system that was supposed to enable us to collaborate better. And it's just a reminder of how much of the humanity of collaboration and of relationship building and trust has not been built into the engineering, and is having to happen on the outside. That's often relying on poorly credited, often non-male participants in the system to recognize and support the emotional and unengineered qualities of the network. And so it's just a reminder to me whenever I interact with these communities how little we seem to understand as collaboration engineers about what actually goes into successful functional human collaboration.
Brilliant. Yeah, I'll pass you straight over to Indra. I just wanted to say, yeah, I massively agree with that aspect. Like, to me, you can't have collaboration without communication, right? So communication sits in the middle, and although you might have engineered a process and a system for managing an actual project, you've still got to have all of the discussion, and all of the group politics still sits around that. So I really agree with the sentiment being discussed in the chat there, that, you know, shared purpose and principles for me are essential, because you can't really have a kind of collaborative working pattern where people are coming together to achieve some shared goal without articulating what is that shared goal. So I do wonder whether there's a need for a slightly more inclusive shared goal or shared purpose between all the organizations that are trying to work on similar projects, even if it's something as base as the fact that we rely on the planet for our survival, and it would be a good idea to try and support that planet in order to ensure our survival, just as a sort of standard shared purpose. But I'll let Indra speak to your comments, Nathan. But yeah, I wondered if people could maybe give us some thoughts on their ideas of the kind of the key tenets of collaboration. Like, what do you actually see? You mentioned there a lot of things, Nathan, but what do the others actually think are kind of the key ingredients to increased and better collaboration? Indra.
Now, I just wanted to respond because I liked all the things that Nathan was pointing at there. And I think that what we need to think about before we even talk about how to collaborate is what stands in the way of collaboration. So, you know, what I was trying to point at in my rather hurried introduction was that so much stands in the way of collaboration in two particular areas. One is in our minds, in our thinking, and one is in our emotions. And both of these things can really cause us not to be connected with the essential thing that sometimes we think is free to collaborate with others. So if we imagine that we're free to collaborate with others by choice, that would be a fine thing. But the question is, are we? And I would say that, you know, I was pointing at narratives in the first place because, you know, to what extent are our minds really free to express our choices and our desires? You know, we are pre-framed in our public life by all these, you know, by the groups that we've decided we belong to, or other people have decided for us that we belong to. Our politics is subdivided into, you know, class groups or gender groups, or I mean, also all different kinds of representations that are then reified in our parliaments. And even though people are not members of political parties, they somehow identify with very, you know, broad blocks, which are then you know, backed up by ideologies that people have had no real opportunity to participate in creating. So they, you know, they're invited to act within these blocks, but also they start to define themselves inwardly with those ideologies or with those parties. And that's not just, you know, politics is only one arena in which to do that. Obviously, in the broader society, we're constantly being defined by our public space. We have less chance to define ourselves. And I think maybe this is a moment, or we've been in this kind of revolution for the past 20 years, where we're trying to explore ourselves more because of the power of the internet. We've been given platforms for ourselves to play on and to you know, interact with each other in new ways. And so we're playing with our own identities. This is an era for that. But it's a post-an era where our identities are sort of decided for us in so many ways. And then there's the emotional content, you know, of a space. You know, does everybody enter into a space of possible collaboration on equal terms? You know, unlikely. You know, there's different levels of agency, different levels of confidence, different vulnerabilities that are entering into that space. And some people are more adept at manipulating others. So it's not, you know, it's not my experience at all that we can walk into a space and just be ourselves and start from that point to collaborate. And then there's the bigger picture of the, you know, the relationship between the individual's contribution and how that melds easily with the social and then with the planetary. You know, it's this idea that we are instantly social beings that are in tune or somehow aligned with the planet is kind of false. We all have different ideas of how we can be individuals, how we can be social, and how we can be, properly thinking about the bigger picture. So I think there are all these obstacles to us being collaborative beings, even before we choose to be one or not.
And do you have thoughts, if we can overcome those challenges, then what are the key ingredients that would make us better at collaboration?
Yeah, I mean, it's first of all, finding spaces in which I do think that the face-to-face, the human-to-human experience of recognizing each other and coming into relationship with each other is very important before we build the digital space that should serve that. It's not my experience that you can find it simply in a digital way. I mean, this is the best that we can manage, being on Zoom. But even being on Zoom is not the same as sitting right opposite you, Ollie or Nathan, and feeling and sensing what you're experiencing as I'm talking. It's been, we're slightly less than that, just watching you as a sort of 2D representation of yourself. I can't sense what's going on that well. So first of all, to come into, physical human connection, I think is more and more important. And then to find ways in which you can create the atmosphere in which people can overcome their initial obstacles quickly, and I give a lot of credit to music and the arts and, those sorts of tools to bring people into some sort of emotional resonance, at least some sort of neutral space, so that they can begin to see each other as human beings and not as, sort of potential, competitors in the space. So, beautiful surroundings really, help people get emotionally into a readiness for collaboration with others.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I especially like the idea of resonance. It touches on an idea that Josh put forward, who I was hoping could join us today, but he wrote this article on harmonious working patterns, and I'll paste a link in the chat in a minute. But he's basically describing how, if we imagine individuals as different notes, that when we kind of play in harmony, that we might establish a triad or a chord which would resonate at a higher level.
Nice.
It's a very interesting article, and I think it has a lot of useful analogies for the kind of collaborative working model.
Yeah, sounds nice.
Matthew, do you have thoughts on the key ingredients of increased or better collaboration?
Yeah. First up, I want to say that I'm not trying to throw out the baby with the bathwater. I recognize that groups are useful. I recognize that engineering is useful. I recognize that mechanistic approaches are useful. But I think it's also important to have other patterns be possible. And at present, we don't think that other patterns really are possible because we don't have the mediums of communication that can enable these more emergent forms of social coordination. And to get the little, what's my cred on that front? I used to do consulting around purpose. I've helped 100,000 person restaurant company define their purpose, after 40 years of successful business, blah, blah, blah. I've gone through this. Even at 100,000 person scale, that's a hard thing. It's hard to figure out where is the alignment that actually matters, that's not just some meaningless abstract statement that doesn't influence what we do on a daily basis, right? And when you get far beyond that into million or billion or multi-billion person scale, the level of alignment in the contexts that individuals are facing on a daily basis, and thus the decisions that they have to make, becomes essentially meaningless. So that's the problem with how do we come into alignment from the top? That's the problem on the limitation of that pattern from my perspective. In terms of the how do we go forward, I really love what Indra had said about the differences between face-to-face communication and video communication and, let's say, Slack, like some text-based communication, because the medium matters. In our team at Holochain, we talk about warm mediums and cold mediums. Text messages, cold medium. What's a colder medium? Likes. Right? Likes have less richness of information available than a written out text message. And a written out text message has less richness of information than audio, because the audio has tone, right? Because our ways of writing don't do a great job of communicating intent, because at least in English, much of intent is communicated through tone and pacing. Completely absent, for the most part, in text. Obviously, as Indra pointed out, it gets richer when you have video, it gets richer when you have in-person, yada, yada, yada. So the medium matters, right? As Marshall McLuhan pointed out, the medium is the message. The real key there is that the mediums of communication that we make use of, the particular grammars, are we in person? Are there Post-it notes? Is it a room that's just got people walking around? Are there chairs all facing the front, right? The architecture of how we are communicating with one another, whether that's digital and the particular grammars, likes, 140 character text messages, rideshare requests, etc., or physical, all chairs facing the front and there's a lecturer, sculpt the possibilities of what can be done. They sculpt, the medium ends up influencing what kinds of coordination actually shows up in the world. And for us, it's really important to recognize that if we do the defining of those grammars from the top, we end up suffering from basically being bogged down in bureaucracy when we want to make them better. Because defining it from the top makes it so that we have to have everybody agree that we're going to change how we're communicating. And so with Holochain, we're not defining one big grammar. We're creating a framework that enables people to to decide on what grammar is right for them in the particular relationship that or sets of relationships that they're engaging in. So if Laura and I were trying to, I don't know, design some thing for a client, like we were doing some consulting gig together, one of the things that we may choose to do is to fly together, to be in the same city and do Post-it notes on a wall. And there's resource commitments and there's effort and there's time, right? There's all this stuff that has to go into that, but that may be the right thing for us to do. And Ollie and I, maybe on that same project, want to coordinate a little bit about how to promote it, to do some recorded conversation. And for us, we actually don't need to fly and be in the same room with Post-it notes. We could do that through Zoom far more cheaply. And my ability to actually use one of those grammars in one set of relationship or set of relationships and another grammar in a different one makes it so that I serve as the bridge between those contexts. There was no boundary of the group that needed to be defined from the top with the set of grammars, right? It was that I, as an agent, can choose to play by a particular way of communicating with Laura and another particular way of communicating with Ollie. And if that works for me, maybe I'll do that again. And maybe if it works for Laura, she'll do that again. But this concept of if it works for me and it works for you, we should be able to try it. And if it keeps working, we should be able to continue doing it, is something we call mutual sovereignty. And it's very different from the defining the group from above. But it does deal with alignment. It just says we don't have to have alignment across the entirety of participants in the ecosystem. We simply have to have alignment amongst those that are participating in a particular relationship. And in that relationship, if they are in alignment, they can communicate, they can coordinate, they can actually do some things in the world. But one of them can be also in alignment with some other people in different ways. And that participant can receive information, maybe off of some Post-it notes that Laura and I had, brainstormed with, and then good ones came to the top and eventually went, these are the best 3 concepts we've got. And I can take those and then use those in my conversation with Ollie in a different medium, different set of relationships, different set of grammars, and do more things with that. And that ends up fostering flows around much richer ecosystems and enabling possibilities that aren't available otherwise. So to kind of put the fine point on it, yep, we need to come into alignment. But it's the dancers themselves who need to, on an ongoing basis, be sensing and responding to, is this working well enough? And when they experience pain, when they experience failure, it's important that they be capable of going, I want to try something different. And not need to wait until the next quarterly meeting to hopefully propose it and then maybe get a representative to actually vote on it. That doesn't allow the ecosystem, the community, to respond nearly quickly enough. It doesn't enable that community to explore sufficiently diverse possibilities in order to surface ones that work. All right.
That's great. Thank you,
I'm
Matthew.
a little passionate. I'm sorry. I apologize.
No, it's important.
This is like life's work stuff, right? So,
I mean, I think the idea of intent is a big point here. And alignment as well is something that I alluded to in my post on, the kind of DNA of collaboration. If you think about the way that the starlings fly in murmurations, right? There's basically only 3 rules which govern those, and they are alignment and separation and cohesion in order to keep that murmuration flowing. So I think, it's a key part of it. But I'll pass you straight over to Laura to respond to that.
I just have a sort of quick point really, which is I totally recognize the importance of the medium, but I do find it interesting how in a lot of these conversations, I think we sometimes place a lot of value on the mediums that we like. So I hear a lot of collaborative and collective conversations which talk a lot about the value of face-to-face, the value of real-time video. And I think we sometimes forget to recognize the incredible privilege that goes along with that. If I have to build a community of practice of people like me who are not near me, and I do not have a travel budget or travel time, I cannot be in a room face-to-face. It simply isn't possible. I have to make do with other things. And I think we sometimes fail to recognize that all of this, the bandwidth and the time that it requires to run video like this and so on, this is a 2-hour call, it's a significant amount of time. So I think we need to think a little bit about privilege and power when we think about the mediums as well, and recognize what different mediums can bring. And I think there's also a sort of side point about different skills and things. I really hate video. I hate being on video. I would be much happier with a text chat, and I would happily sacrifice the depth and richness of a lot of video for more text chat, which I can read asynchronously in my own time and not have to present myself and make myself vulnerable by putting, my image and my voice in front of other people. So I think there's some really interesting dynamics, particularly to come back to the original framing of this conversation about scale. Because scale is not a handful of us getting together and having a nice dinner. It's a whole load of us figuring out how we can work with people that we have never met in many cases. Yeah, and thank you, Ben, for the side note about the greenhouse gases. I didn't even mention that. But yeah, flying is a huge carbon privilege.
I think that point about power and privilege is really important here. One of the talks at the first Platform Co-op conference that to me framed like the challenge and contradiction of what we were doing, in trying to build a kind of new online cooperative economy was this provocation about, it came from Juliet Shore, about her research on platforms of different kinds. She'd been comparing nonprofit and for-profit online platforms. And one thing she noticed was the nonprofit, mission-driven ones were more homogenous, actually, than the for-profit, greedy, evil ones, right? which we're able to attract a much more diverse network of people. And that's a real danger when we're relying on bond ties of direct affinity, comfort, intentional connection to be our social relations, right? Again, it comes back. One way of framing it is around commerce. I mean, it kind of limits the scope of your potential market for the perspective of something like an Uber, but for the perspective of a political formation, it limits your ability to do solidarity, right? And so it limits your ability to stand with people who, as Laura said, you don't have the opportunity to be with all the time. You don't have the opportunity to have thick relationships with. One organization that I'm really, really grateful for in the United States here and around cooperative development is called the New Economy Coalition, because they've really worked. They kind of do the work of building diverse networks in around work that would otherwise be pretty separate. They're along racial lines, along class lines, so forth. They do the intentional work that a lot of the smaller groups have trouble doing on their own, and it forces them to be in contact, in conversation with people that they wouldn't themselves even know how to reach out to, or wouldn't bother reaching out to, or see sufficient financial value in reaching out to, and so forth. And that's where I think these artificial constructs of organizations are so important, where intentional construction of coalitions is important, because sometimes our instincts lead us in ways that atomize us, that individualize us, and keep us in our comfort zones, where we need, these kinds of, blocky, awkward structures sometimes to enable us to stand as a group with people who we might have some shared interests with, but don't necessarily have shared networks or relationships with.
Indra, thoughts on that?
We're going around passing the parcel, aren't we? So, I'm agreeing with what you're saying, Nathan. And I was also really interested in what you said, Laura, because when it comes to privilege, I'm much more used to hearing about people talking about technological cooperation and being online as the privilege that they don't have. So we're always running into the objection to even be talking about technology as if it was a factor in the lives of so many people who, don't spend time online in the course of their day. They're getting up, they're going to work, coming home late, they're cooking dinner, going to bed. I mean, there's no time for the big narrative, that in our mainstream press, let's say that we all spend our time online. Well, yeah, a lot of us do, and a lot of us don't, and there's an assumption about familiarity with all the language, and even being on Instagram or even being on Twitter is still seen as quite an elite thing in a lot of the communities that I work in. So, but I totally appreciate what you're saying, and then that we should always be able to draw these continuums around the tensions and say, at one end is this and another end is this, and this is the whole conversation. It's a complex conversation. How do we convey this complexity? In my experience, being in a room where people can physically embody that complexity with use of great facilitation techniques, it works really well. It works. It helps people to embody what their minds have been telling them is the truth, and then challenging it in quite a different way. So for example, and I'm just going to be, really prosaic here, being in a room with Remainers and Leavers, for example, is it's almost impossible to have that conversation online without people constantly pulling in opposite directions, because they can. It's easy to do that. Whereas when you're physically in a space with people, there's something challenging you all the time about the fact that person, you know, feel something around what they're saying. You know, they're not simply parroting something, they're delivering what they're saying with feeling, and you can sense from their presence that there's an investment there that you have to take into account when you're listening to them. And the whole, you know, the whole demand for listening is a very different thing in person than it is online. You know, how do you actively listen online? It's a hard thing to achieve. So, you know, obviously we are talking here. This is a conversation about technology, and I'm loving, Matthew, actually you trying to describe what you're trying to achieve, which we would love somebody to achieve. You know, we would love it if somebody could really deliver on this, the complexity of people's movements and, you know, and intuitions and thoughts, and the way that they have, you know, different ways of organizing themselves and yet still want to make connections between those things. We're waiting for that technology that can really carry the whole human you know, array of warm and cold connectivity. We haven't seen it yet. You know, if that's on offer, we will want to inhabit that thing, and we will say, you know, we've been talking to Arthur Brock, you know, about this, how, you know, the design process of this, and that's another whole conversation that Ollie, I know, we've been having about where women fit into the design process for this. But we've got something to look forward to, I hope, that this thing will arise, that is that sensitive, that is that capable of communicating at the level where human beings can communicate with each other in a space. That's all to look forward to as far as I'm concerned.
Matthew, do you want to come back to that?
Yeah, I'd love to touch on a couple of things. One of the mediums that I've been using on this call is Trello. I have Trello on my phone, so I've been taking notes on what people are saying and going, oh, I should, you know, this is a fun thing to dance with there. Briefly, I'll touch on what Indra said at the end. Yep, us too. We're really excited. You know, this has been life's work, right? I lived in my car for like a year and a half so that I didn't have to do consulting work, so that I could focus on trying to get this off the ground. And we've kind of bent over backwards in a variety of ways to try to seed Holochain, you know, nourish it, finance it, etc., in ways that would allow us to play by an unusual playbook, right? So open source, but also free, and there's no business model. But then we have a separate thing that does have a business model, and that's a for-profit company that's then owned by the nonprofit that actually also controls Holochain, right? So we've done all this stuff, and we managed to sort of, you know, figure our way through, at least to a place where we've got resources and are taking a good swipe at it. And we're just now getting to, I think this quarter, we're going to be getting to the place where people are actually building scalable, meaning production-ready applications on Holochain. Or I shouldn't say on, using Holochain, because it's not a platform, right? It's just a way of building applications. So yeah, we're excited too. And that said, like, even though we've got this crazy grand ambition, like the actual scope of what we're building is not that big. It's actually pretty small, because we're not believers in the technology will solve it, right? The whole point here is creating a medium of communication that enables humans to solve it in their actual contexts that they're living in. And so there's this whole other layer, or layer upon layer upon layer of work that needs to be done, and that will be done, and people going, oh, let's try this thing and play with it in these ways, and go, oh, that didn't work, and let's try something different. And to the point that Laura made earlier about the different mediums of communication and the richness being better. No. Different, right? They're different. I'm really grateful for GitHub, or Git. GitHub is a particular company that provides a service, but Git is a software, basically, that enables people to do collaborative software development in this very emergent way. It turns out Git is agent-centric, The perspective of the participant themselves is core to how that system is organized, and it's what unleashed open source software in a whole different level. It got designed because by Linus Torvalds, the founder of Linux, because he had this big open source, software community, and they were struggling to collaborate, and he designed a different system. That's a medium of communication that's actually really cold relative to in-person speaking, and totally appropriate for the form of coordination that those people are trying to accomplish. So there's no like one dimension of usefulness. It's always contextual. It's what are you trying to do? What are you capable of? Who are you trying to work with? Okay, and then what are the grammars? What is the medium or sets of mediums that are going to be useful for helping foster those particular flows of communication, those particular forms of transformation? And then related to that, the discussion came up around power and privilege is so right on. I just want to celebrate. That is exactly the right conversation to have. And in fact, that's largely what drives our intention, because within groups, power and privilege make it so that under the best of intentions, a whole bunch of people's effort gets sculpted towards the ends that serve a few. And that's because of the dynamic of hierarchy. I mean, the basic pattern of hierarchy is, hey, let's get a few people in the middle, and they're going to actually steer the efforts of this much larger community. And even in democracy, when we go, but we want to all have a voice, if the only grammar that you have is a vote, it turns out that's actually a really simple grammar. It has very little richness of communication. It's an all or nothing thing that is easily manipulated, yada, 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 right? That ends up leading to systems of power abuse that we see all over the place. And so for us, the power and privilege issue is the issue. And the defining of grammars, of the ways in which we're going to communicate, how we're going to make decisions, whether or not we're going to dedicate resources, right? There is no one-size-fits-all answer to that. And so we think it's really important that the participants themselves be able to try things and go, this isn't working for me. I don't want to continue playing that way without having to necessarily have gone through a bureaucratic process. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't also use bureaucratic processes. We should. But they shouldn't be our only possible way of changing direction. In the open source community, the concept of forking, somebody going, hey, I'm going to make a copy of this and then change it, and the original continues to exist, and anybody who wants to use that original can continue to use it, but I can also try something new, is really the key driver that unleashes all the possibilities that have become possible in that open source world. And we're seeking to enable that that kind of pattern to be available more generally for the coordinate, the how we dance together, wayfinding that we think is necessary kind of across the board. And then the last piece I'll say, and I'll try to keep it short, because power and privilege really do matter, and because technology and technological literacy, not just the resources, but the awareness and knowledge of how to build software, or how to, all those kinds, or how to use a website, or because those things are not evenly distributed, it was really important for us to try to build systems that that were as efficient as possible, right? Blockchain, incredibly inefficient. Tons of wasted electricity, yada, yada, yada. No governance wasn't it was actually designed to avoid governance. So to Nathan's point, they're finding themselves doing politics, et cetera, yada, yada, because they didn't actually think about that as part of a system. They thought it was just an engineering feat, right? That's a misunderstanding of the problem, a misunderstanding of the complexity of the system at issue. We're trying to actually incorporate that, but have it be, hey, if you have a phone or even something as light as a Raspberry Pi, not everybody's going to have that on day one, but the trend has been that smartphones and other computing devices are getting cheaper and more accessible more widely. And we wanted to make it so that even with the simplest of computing devices, you could start to augment your coordinative capacity in ways that work for you. And you shouldn't have to pay anybody else or defer to their preferences for the privilege. That if you want to try something different, you can. And you can alongside anybody else who also has some device or has access to one and wants to play by those particular patterns as well. All right.
Thank you, Matthew. Awesome. It's good. It's good though. All lots of value in there, and too much to pick up on. I just want to kind of hear from Laura and Nathan, and then maybe open it up to the group, because I'm sure other people have got things that they want to say. So we'll try and let all the attendees speak as well. But I just wanted to touch there on what you mentioned about Git, which I think was a really good and useful kind of analogy for us to think about here. So if we think that Git enabled this open source software development to kind of come together and progress in a way by forking and branching and merging again, like, to me, if we consider the challenge to be greater intergroup collaboration, then I wonder what that kind of equivalent is, that Git equivalent, which is going to enable groups like, you know, even like the Red Cross with humanitarian aid, with the World Bank, who've all got similar purposes. Like, how can they see that shared purpose and actually pit their worth together in order to achieve greater output? I guess one of the things that Git does is forces you to work on a shared purpose, right? Either you're trying to develop the same piece of software or you're developing a different piece of software. If you disagree about the purpose and you want it to do something slightly different, you branch it off, but it can come back. So that's an interesting way of kind of, allowing people to form around a kind of shared interest, or kind of using a shared vocabulary, if you like. And I wonder if there is a sort of more organizational model that we could imagine that might enable groups to share that kind of larger overview and to see whether they are flying in the same direction, if they need to branch off or they want to come back together. That's kind of what I was hoping we could get to, but it's obviously it's a hard challenge. It's a big subject, and we're all very hopeful that Holochain might enable some of that for us. I'll pass you straight over to Laura next.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to riff off that, you mentioned, and I know this is probably a random selection, but humanitarian aid and the Red Cross and the various other initiatives there. It might look like they all share the same aims, and certainly humanitarianism does have some shared values, but the different organizations, particularly the large ones that are involved in humanitarian relief, have fundamentally different ideas about the world, fundamentally different ways of working. I haven't done like a textual analysis of their value statements or their mission statements, but they are not the same. And so one of the reasons they can coordinate in relief settings is that they are not the same. They recognize that each has different strengths and weaknesses, and they can therefore work out who's going to do what bit, you know, with more or less success. I will absolutely agree. But I think that differentiation is an important thing. And so just sort of come back to the sort of original questions of sort of what does good collaboration look like? It's interesting because when you posed that in the pre-read, I was thinking, it's really tough, right? I really struggle to think of good examples of good collaboration at scale. But I think some of that is, for me, it's always about grounding the conversation. How can we ground it in something that's real enough to know what good looks like? So when I think about the shared values of organizations that are working together, yes, there's some shared values and there's some different values. Values are a bit like strategy. You know, there's the classic line about strategy, right? Which is, if no one can object to it, it's not really a strategy. If you just say, yeah, motherhood and apple pie and fluffy bunnies, it's great, everyone's going to love it, but it's not really a strategy because it doesn't actually help you steer a course. And I think values and mission statements are very similar as well, right? When I used to work at the Open Knowledge Foundation, Open Knowledge International as it's known as now, we had stated values going back to the earliest days of the organization, 5 main values that were, I think it was. And one of them was actually quite controversial, but it was the most useful value we had. And that was pragmatic, not fanatic. And we needed to use that as a value a lot because we needed to use things like, for instance, we chose to use Google Docs as a way of collaborating on, you know, certain documentation. And there would always be members of the free and open source community who would come and say, look, guys, you shouldn't be using Google Docs, try these other things. Well, we could say pragmatic, not fanatic. we're using Google Docs because it just works right now, it's good enough. And because we had a value, we could not get stuck in the kind of classic bike shedding conversations in which we would debate what platform we're going to use to even collaborate on documenting. So having values that people can object to, I think, is something to think about for collaboration, because it helps focus the mind and mean that you actually get stuff done, not just talking about how nice it would be if we could all just collaborate more effectively. So that was one thing I wanted to share. The second thing is actually about really, I think we've talked quite a bit about the idea of a shared vision or purpose and how much that's necessary for good collaboration. I like to, because I'm very practical, I like to have that shared vision. I like to know what I'm doing and to know what good looks like, as I invest effort in a collaboration, particularly actually if it's a collaboration where I'm putting my own personal energies that I'm not, being paid to labor on. And I think it's actually very difficult to have that shared understanding. I know we've got some members of the Digital Life Collective, I think, in the audience, and I would love to hear from them as well. But I was one of the co-founders of the Digital Life Collective, one of the early members, and I had great hopes that for me it was going to be a vehicle for certain kinds of collaborative activity, building a different kind of future for technology. And after 18 months, I realized that for me at least it was not working, because it seemed like we had a shared purpose, but we didn't. We were all hearing the same words and hearing fundamentally different things in those words. And it took me 18 months of a lot of time and energy and talking face-to-face, lots of face-to-face time, as well as a lot of video time, with the other sort of active members of the collective. And so I think it was something really interesting for me, and how could it be that it could take so long not to realize that we didn't actually have that shared purpose? Because it felt like we did. We had a set of words we were all signing on to, but we didn't actually agree about the meaning of those words. And so I think that was also something really interesting to me to think about, how we can, how do you spot that sort of thing? How do you actually know if your vision is agreed? And finally, the final point I wanted to make, shared values that make sense and that are not just fluffy bunnies, shared vision that is actually genuinely shared. And my third point would be recognizing the labor of the glue in a community or a network and the fabric. And I think everyone has referred to this a little bit, the effort it takes to join together disparate things, to translate, to document, to transcribe, to support a community and make it happen. Actually recognizing and supporting the people who are providing that labor and distributing that labor as evenly as we can, I think is a real challenge for collaboration, but super important. The invisible glue fabric of things, all too frequently invisible, rather. We should be surfacing it and recognizing it. Really key. That's it for me.
Awesome. Thanks, Laura. That was brilliant. Nathan?
Well, yeah, I would just add to that list that Laura talked about, shared infrastructure. In the use of the example of Git, for instance, my mind just goes to what is lurking around that, right? On the one hand, you have the kind of benevolent dictator for life phenomenon that Linus Torvalds represents, where these open source communities so often default to a kind of autocracy model. And then they're also relying on legal structures that are financial and leveraging resources from, the most wealthy institutions interacting with that software, like the Linux Foundation and other open source entities. And it's, I think, it's interesting that I'm glad Matt brought this example up, but it's also striking to me that he had the Freudian slip of referring to GitHub before Git. It was GitHub that really made Git accessible to more people, turned it into a reputation system, built it into the kind of the powerhouse that it is today. As if you've ever used Git on a command line, it's a very different experience. The core software as opposed to the centralized platform that Microsoft now owns and paid a bunch of billions of dollars for. And so I think we need to not be too quick to think that these kinds of very peer-to-peer technologies, even those that have been the most successful in our world, are happening without some of these really core centralization features. And so I argue that we should centralize intentionally and recognize that centralization will happen and develop it in ways that are accountable to our community. and that we are intentional about how we deploy resources. So, for instance, I think it would be really neat to think about something like what the New Economy Coalition that I mentioned earlier is doing in the U.S. more globally. Maybe the Open Co-op is the resource for that, where different projects around the world that have a sense of shared purpose in this space are financially contributing according to their scale, and that enables, and they also have some governance rights associated with that, and that enables them to identify common projects and direct those resources in a way that I think only a centralized entity can do and should do. Centralization to some degree, is a way of actually preventing more centralization, like benevolent dictators for life, which I think we already have, the danger of emerging even in this space. And so I think we need to be, more intentional about building those institutions. I'm afraid that I really have to go. I have a previously planned edit-a-thon for this new ridiculous collaboration project, which is I just posted the link. We're doing an edit-a-thon for this wiki on open and free and non-surveillance ed tech. If anybody after this is over wants to join us, we'll be using video and asynchronous chat and all sorts of stuff to move that along. So thank you, Ollie. Thank you all of you who've been actively listening and fellow panelists. This has been really really fantastic. Thanks to all of you for your insights. I'm really sorry I have to leave.
No problem. Thanks for joining us, Nathan, and good luck at the editathon. Cheers, ciao. So I think, before other people have to leave, we'll just see if there are some questions from the attendees. If anybody in the attendee list wants to speak, I think you can raise your hand and we can just make you a speaker, and then you can ask a question, or you can bung a question in the Q&A there. In fact, maybe we can even kick off with that one, because somebody's asked a question. Ben Roberts has asked to Matthew, if the forest is a good metaphor, what is the way to interpret species as well as specific groups of species, e.g. grove of trees or warren of rabbits? I don't know if that's easy.
That's a wonderful question. So I talked a little earlier about the whole use of a name, right, to describe something and how that's useful. Let's say a grove of trees. It's useful to identify that there's 7 trees there, or whatever it happens to be, right? But that's a categorization, right? It's a naming that is useful for the party that is doing that naming. It's inside of them that this reduction in complexity is happening, because there's all sorts of stuff happening in that grove, right? There's flows of air and water and soil, and there's creatures coming through, and there's poop, and it's not just a grove of trees. That's a tool for somebody who's trying to make their way through the mountains, maybe, to go, oh, I'm supposed to take a left at the grove of trees, right? And so I wrote I half wrote an article that's on I think on Medium, maybe the Holochain Medium or the Holo Medium, called something like How Consciousness Emerges and Persists. And I meant to write a second half, but I tend to be bad at those sorts of things. And the first half is not all that well written, in my opinion. It's not as clear as I would like it to be. But what I was trying to point out is, I'll just briefly outline the overview. Every interaction, let's say Laura and I have a conversation, right? Every interaction is a communication, right? Laura says something, the sound wave hits my eardrum. I hear that, like my eardrum changes shape. I am transformed by that. Because I've spoken English for a long time and have lots of practice with it, I don't just get changed physically. There's other things that happen in my brain, and I actually make meaning out of the words that she spoke. Okay, but every interaction ends up leading to communication, and in that, things that Laura did end up altering me. And maybe if I'm able to do, speak back or communicate in some other way, I may actually end up altering Laura. And if later on, at some point, Laura says, hey, can you pick up, Sam? And I'm like, Sam? She's like, Sam. And then she grabs this little key. This is a surfboard fin key. I surf. This is Sam. And I was like, oh, okay. We had a failure. We had a communication and a failure of alignment. Right? I didn't know what she was referring to. We had additional communication, some of which included physical touch, her grabbing this thing and holding it up. It had light coming off of it. She used additional words. This is Sam. Next time she goes, hey, can you grab Sam? I'm going to go, where's that little orange key thing? Right? And suddenly we've actually built a shared grammar. We've come into alignment around something through this dance that we've been doing. And what I think is interesting and why we focused on studying nature is that there are patterns in nature that enable coherence, the functioning collaboration to emerge through exactly that kind of process. To touch on the forest question, when we do that, when Laura and I start being able to say things like, hey, can you grab Sam? And I can just pick up a key and blah, blah, blah. There's no longer just a Laura and a Matthew, and they are completely separate. There's also this other entity that now exists in the world, and maybe always existed, but it has a particular dynamic now, and that's Matthew plus Laura. That's us as, a group. A simpler example or an easier example to envision is dancing, right? It's hard for me to do certain kinds of dances alone. You sometimes need a dance partner. Swing dancing, for instance. You don't have that other body there, certain moves you just can't do. But if let's say Laura and I start swing dancing and we get lots of practice and we get good at it and she's throwing me in the air, we're doing aerials, sweet. We are an entity. We're still Matthew and still Laura, but we're also this other thing, which is this duo that's able to do this dance. And if there happens to be a band in the room too, and there's not just them playing music and us dancing to it, but some feedback loop where they're actually paying attention to how we're dancing and adjusting how they're playing music. Wow, what an interesting, rich, larger entity that also exists. Years ago, I helped organize a conference on the future of working in Silicon Valley. But the actual title that we came up with was The Future of Working, Individuals, Organizations, and Ecosystems. But the real point was that everything you look at is always all three. It just depends on what perspective you're looking at it from. So you could say Matthew is an individual. You could say Matthew is an organization. He's got a bunch of organs, right? And they're collaborating in ways that result in Matthew-ness, as my friend Nora would say. I shared some good links, by the way, in the chat with Nora and her father Gregory's work. I highly recommend checking those out. And an ecosystem, there's cells and bacteria and all these things that are themselves individuals and are collaborating in ways that lead to larger forms of organization, which are themselves collaborating in ways that lead to a larger thing. So depending on what you look, from their perspective, I'm an ecosystem, right? From the perspective of my heart, maybe I'm an organism or an organization. From the perspective of Ollie or other people, I'm an individual. But I'm all three, always. And so is everything else. And so the forest is an entity, but it's also a whole bunch of entities, right? And there's my perspective on this, and this is a really weird way of thinking. It tells you how abstract and off the charts I am, crazy or whatever, is that there's literally infinite variations simultaneously existing. But we end up focusing on one or two at any particular point in time. So I end up perceiving of the boundary of Matthew as the edge of my skin, or the boundary of Matthew as this group, right? I perceive of my family as me, or my little unit in the military as me. And that's a really useful and important thing, because this fluid boundary of self enables us to come into alignment. and it's not just a hack. It's not just like, oh, that's quick. It's actually real. We actually are those other things. So without, I'm seeing Indra raising a hand because I've gone on and I do want to hear what she's saying. I think that at the end of the day, spirituality and love point at this reality of us not just being separate, but also being connected. But it also is true that we are not just connected, that there is difference. There is ways in which we are not all simply the same. And that in that richness is really what makes the world beautiful, interesting, and sort of fun to be in. Okay, Indra.
Let's hear from Indra, and then it'd be nice to hear quickly from Josh, who's just turned up as well, just briefly.
And I'd like to hear from Josh too, but I'm not going to answer fully what you're saying, Matthew. I just want to respond, which is just to take your metaphor one step further. It feels me a little bit as if we need to ask whether we can see the wood for the trees, right? And there's a reason for asking that question. Yes, I'm a Buddhist, lifelong. I understand everything you're saying, and I resonate with what you're saying. But we've been presented with this window, this climate window of 12 years, and there's a necessity, right, to be able to perceive the bigger picture. Yeah, A, how we have organized ourselves in the past, and B, how we could reorganize ourselves for the future. If we're not willing to do that, I think we're going to fail ourselves, because we have got the opportunity to do that. Tech will be really incredibly important for that. You have to hold the complex individual. You have to hold it yourself as you move into this bigger space with others in order to get results. And just to flag up directly to your question, Ollie, where are the examples of collaboration that have worked? Well, if you look at our society, if you look what we've achieved actually as a result of the 20th century, it's a kind of feast of collaboration of kinds, right? I mean, I can walk out my door, call a taxi, switch on my electricity. Something has worked right up to this point. Unfortunately, it's also led to the demise of the planet. So now we have to reorganize. But it's not that we're not capable and we've never had any demonstrations of the mass collaboration of human beings, but mostly through the instrumentalization of most people by the few. So now we're reorganizing, but we should be able to take at least what we've learned so far and look at the bigger picture. And like for me, take back control of your mind, own your own complexity, but find the things that help you to collaborate with others in order to get a result. Results is what we need now. I'm just stopping now. Hear from Josh.
Great, thanks, Indra. And welcome, Josh. Maybe just introduce yourself quickly, if you can unmute yourself and let people know who you are, where you are, what you do, and mention harmonious working patterns.
Hi, sorry, I'm on a bus, just landed on a flight. Hi, I'm Josh. Sorry I'm late and all that. Flying, and probably got a lot of noise in the background. But so I met Oliver through Open App Ecosystem, where he posted collaboration at scale, although we've talked a few times previously, I think. I'm working with Giveth.io, and we're essentially an emergent organization that's kind of spinning up a group of hack teams to create a common stack, which is why I'm in Amsterdam, although it sounds like Holochain might have absolutely smashed it from the reading that I've done recently. Nonetheless, who knows, we might build some apps in your ecosystem as a result. It'd be great to do that. Otherwise, I posted back to Oliver's collaboration at scale, because I've been in kind of a bunch of leaderless groups, and I've kind of seen how the lack of direction seems to kind of cause everything to blow apart at the seams, or it definitely has a high churn rate anyway. So I wrote up an article from kind of thoughts, I guess, surrounding that, which were minimal viable collaboration for non-entities like ourselves that don't necessarily have a singular objective. We just want to create positive impact. So the thought was to pair in threes, and yeah. So the general flow of the idea is that with two people you get increased focus, but that's still, it's used in pair programming all the time, but I believe it generally takes its direction from kind of Trellos or Kanbans or Jira, and I'm not so sure that like having top down or somebody feeding up a Kanban is the way to go, because it kind of still predicts the future, which I'm not so keen on. As such, I'm borrowing from a guy called Biedler, who is a Gurdjieffian descent, but the idea is that with two people, you can agree on a third party that might add directionality, I guess, to your working group. And from that, you can decide on some work to do together, after which you can disband the group again and create some kind of self-similarity with another group. So if there's three of you, two of you can carry the work forward afterwards and pull in a new partner. So that's the idea I had. I'm sorry I missed the rest of the call, but it's nice to meet you guys. Pass it back to Oliver, I guess.
Thanks, Josh. No, really interesting. I just want, maybe Laura has got something to say about that, and then maybe we jump to this question from Nenad in the chat asking about the difference between coordination, cooperation, and collaboration.
I'm not sure that I have anything in particular to respond on that point, but that was really helpful. Thanks, Josh.
I think, yeah, it's definitely an idea that would be nice to discuss in more detail, like the idea of the kind of triad that you describe and the way that you see is helping accelerate collaboration. I like the idea of the kind of harmony of the chord and how that parallels with the kind of murmurations pattern that I've been getting at in my discussions about increased collaboration. But I struggle to see, yeah, how we might necessarily identify, like your post is quite musical. So if I don't know what a kind of fifth is, or I don't understand the octave as well as anybody else, then it might be quite hard for me to identify which note I need in order to improve my chord. Is that something you can answer from a bus?
Yeah, I think that it's all jazz. So whoever you like, really, you can get some really discordant chords, and that's gravy. Yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on it. But it's allegorical to music, so it's non-prescriptive, apart from having a Schelling point to converge on around music, harmony of all sorts. You could turn it into color theory by transposing up 3 octaves, into infinity. I don't know. Sorry, I don't know where I am.
No problem. Thanks, Josh. I can see Matthew unmuting himself and getting ready to play us a chord, so I'll let him do that.
A couple of the chords that Josh mentioned in his article were C major, I think, and A minor. And one of the points he made was that there's only one note of difference there. So these two notes stay the same. But in the first chord, there's this note, which is a G. And in the second chord, there's this note instead, which is an A. And I really enjoyed the article, John. It was about, hey, we can combine things in different ways, and it can lead to different possibilities. It can open up new pathways. When I play keyboard a fair bit. More recently, this is kind of I played a little as a kid, and recently it's been like, I need to play something, and that looks like a fun way to play. But generally, I play keyboard by sometimes reading music, but often just wandering around. And then you stumble on something that's like, ooh, that's interesting. And you play with that for a little bit and you stay there. And then at some point you go, I want to move on from this. And you explore a little more. Here's another, and you stumble and no, that didn't work. And no, that didn't work. Oh, that's interesting too. But the piece that showed up for me around that article was it's always in context, right? That this might be great here when it's all by itself, but if we had started out with something like, I don't know, right, it becomes a different thing. And so it depends on what was coming before, what shows up in the middle, what shows up after. And the beauty of all of this is that it's not a static thing. Like music makes so wonderfully visible that this is not objects. This is flows, or my preferred term, dances, right? And that each of those notes is a dancer, kind of. The difference between humans and notes is humans have agency. And so they can go, is this working for me or not? And actually, I believe that in all biological systems, you basically have a similar thing. You have agency at the quote unquote parts. I have my issues with the word parts, but you have agency. And if that particular dance doesn't serve that agent, let's say, eventually that thing goes away. Either they decide to stop doing that dance because they're like, this isn't working for me, or they go extinct. And if they're not there any longer because they went extinct, guess what? That dance isn't getting done any longer. And for us, that is why the mutual sovereignty stuff is so important, right? It has to work for you and me to do this dance. And if at some point, because of a different shift in my context, maybe, it no longer works for me, it's important for me to go and try to do a different dance. If we aren't able to do that, we don't have the feedback loops to actually generate the richness of complexity to get to what Indra was talking about in terms of the solutions. I completely agree with what you had said, Indra, around we don't have any time. Right? My big fear is that we are too late. And I'm doing the best I can, right, to get this stuff out there as quickly as possible. And the reality is we need people like Josh's team who are going to be the early drivers, right? The world is not even. An illiterate farmer in Uganda is probably not going to build the first Holochain app. And that's a bummer, but that is the world as it is, and I don't get to change it. But folks like Josh they can build things that solve real problems and pioneer some new patterns, and pretty soon those things will be more accessible. Not initially. Initially, our stuff's going to be clunky because it's new. But the goal is to enable that richness of collaborative possibility to emerge. And I don't think that the coming into alignment at the top can get us there. Because we've been aware of, as Indra had said, we've been aware of the problem for like 50 years. We've even been aware of some of the things that we might want to try to solve the problem. So awareness is not the issue. We actually need different capacity. Okay. Indra, you were raising a hand.
Yeah, not only because I suddenly had this vision of the self as the jazz tune, with all the different, so our multiple personalities, which we have multiple personalities, each one of us resulting from our culture and our experience and history. If we can bring those within ourselves into a tune that we're enjoying, then, that makes us feel more autonomy, it makes us feel whole, makes us feel happy. And then I love what Ollie was talking about with the murmuration, that we should be able to act almost, experiencing our own autonomy, our self-expression, our own integrity all the time, but with just enough space between us that allows us to respond to the big ideas or to respond to where people are leading, but never losing that sense of the whole tune that is me. So I'm a tune, you're a tune. I don't think I'm a note. There's no way that I'm a note, but I could be a whole jazz thing, You know, it might even be a genre. I don't know. Or maybe it's more dubstep in my case. I don't know, but it's like, you know, it's. But to be able to own that, I think that's one of the things we haven't achieved at all in our society so far, is to give people permission to own their own tune and to get to that thing, and then to recognize each other's otherness in tunes, and then to be able to move with that. You know, that's what I love about your murmuration thing, Ollie, is that we need to have just about enough space between us to allow ourselves to be those very different things. And I've often thought about with our collaboratories that we should have musical events where, you know, we have like dance-offs between different kinds of, you know, musical genres, like, you know, who are the trance guys here, and who are the northern soul people, and who are the jazzers, and who are the, you know, it's like, can we create that as a new, can we move into that as a new kind of set of differences that we actually enjoy, rather than, you know, these head-on clashes which are all about material economic needs, which, you know, which is such a reduction of ourselves as human beings. Anyway, I'm just riffing on what you were all saying, because I'm enjoying what it's evoking. Can we get there? I don't know.
Thanks, Indra. No, it's really nice to hear. And I think what you made me think there was about the idea of the murmurations. Like, those birds, those starlings flying in their murmurations don't necessarily, or we don't know if they have any kind of larger shared purpose. Sorry, looking outside, because it's just started hailing in no apparent reason. And then if you kind of throw an eagle into the equation, right? So you've got all these birds doing this beautiful dance and playing to this same music in the sky, and then you get an eagle comes and flies into the middle, and there are some great videos of this on YouTube from around Rome. Then you see the kind of whole community morphs and melds in a way that you never could have predicted. And because of the kind of scale of these murmurations, the number of birds there, the eagle can't focus on any one particular bird. So it ends up actually not managing to catch anybody. And you see this kind of, the group as a whole, their kind of music, if you like, or their dance, their pattern that they're playing to changes dramatically without any kind of central leader saying, okay, everyone dodge the eagle. They kind of know that they have this, you know, innate kind of want to not be eaten by the eagle, but they behave collectively in a way that you never could have predicted just by looking at one individual starling on its own. And I guess it's those kinds of patterns, like the way of actually kind of seeing the kind of the potential for the movement between larger groups and groups of individuals, that I'm really interested in. We're rapidly running out of time. I see there's a raised hand here from Ben Roberts. Ben, I don't know if you're still there and if your question is related and you want to speak.
No, I had an answer, actually, rather than a question. And a shortish story that might be relevant, but maybe we don't have time. I don't know.
We've got 5 minutes, so far away.
Well, it was sparked by Ninad's question about, you know, the difference between, I think he used coordination, collaboration, and cooperation. Were those the three?
That's right.
Yeah, so I've been stewarding an initiative called the Thriving Resilient Communities Collaboratory. We heard that word a couple of times from Indra, although we have a slightly different take on it. Since 2013, and it's a network of about 30 organizational leaders, all working on how we build thriving, resilient communities, you know, local scale transformation, but how do we do that across the entire United States? And the original thesis was these organizations should be working together more. New Economy Coalition, which we also heard mentioned, is one of them. And Transition Towns in the US, another. And the thought was they're all working on similar things. They ought to be collaborating. And they ought to be doing projects where they're all actually working as partners. And so we set out to catalyze that and found that that was really hard, right? And in fact, all these organizations were already doing things that were pretty powerful, and they're all understaffed and they're all underfunded. And if they had more capacity to do stuff, it would be to do what they've already figured out they really think is powerful. And so instead of trying to force that level of collaboration, we realized that other things are also possible, that cooperating or coordinating activities is very easy, much lower hanging fruit, just sharing, for example, information about each other's events or participating in them. Or when you're creating, and this is what then emerged out of it, we said, maybe thinking together about how to manage grant money, because we had a partner that was a grant provider, the Threshold Foundation, and that was part of how the collaboratory formed. That we've got these people with money, they're making decisions about who gets it, and actually they wanted to bring that down to the organizations on the ground and have us collaboratively make those decisions. So suddenly we had a collaborative activity that really mattered to everybody. And what emerged from that is the things the group wanted to fund were less these complex multi-organizational collaborations. We tried that. It was more, let's support the work that's already got a lot of integrity and momentum. And as the group started to do that, they also started to write each other into their grants in different ways, because we were all making the decisions together about what to fund, including funding ourselves, as well as people outside of our own membrane, another layer of complexity to it. And so all these layers have evolved from that we're coordinating, we're cooperating more, we are now collaborating, but in more organic rather than forced ways, built on what's already in motion. And then another C that emerges co-creation, right? And instead of starting with what we're already doing as building blocks and fitting them together, what can we do that nobody's doing yet? What can emerge out of nowhere? And so we're exploring, I think, through a very practical set of mechanisms, all of these things. The one last thing I'll add that has also really shifted it is that this was happening at a national level. And we realized because the scale of changes at the community level, we needed to be more grounded in our work. And we started creating regional scale focal points for our work. And now that's emerging with networks of regional scale relationships we developed with a lot of trust, so that new projects are showing up that build on that layer of relationship and network. And we've got one now happening in New England where libraries all around the region are going to be hosting climate change conversations in September. And we now have a grant proposal that layers on top of that to do all kinds of other cool things, bringing in all sorts of partners, all kinds of collaboration, without the need for top-down coordinating on goals and metrics and theories of change or anything, because it's just all there to be played with as an ecosystem that we've helped to generate. So that's my story.
Thank you, Ben. That's awesome. And in fact, probably a pretty good place to stop, because you've highlighted a few great examples there of actual collaboration in action. And yeah, I think I echo what's being said in the chat there. Really useful. So I'm going to wrap this up now, and just like to say thank you to everyone for listening. Matthew, Laura, Indra, Dill for co-hosting, Josh for joining us, and Nathan as well, obviously. We will have more Open 2019 webinars. Just have a look at the events page, open.coop/events, and the next one will be listed. If you want to list your own event, go there and scroll to the bottom, add your own event, and let us know what you want to do. I'll endeavor to see if this video has worked and if it's any good. Might even pop that on the internet and save out the chat as well. Thanks to everyone for putting their comments in. There's some fantastic and really useful links there, so we'll try and save those out, and anybody who wants to follow those up, they will also be on the website. Thanks again, and hopefully see you all soon.
Thank you all.
Thank
Cheers.
you.
Thanks, everyone.
Ciao, ciao.